Welcome to Nero Secrets. I'm your host, Jimmy. Tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more mystery stories. Let's get started. Nero Wolfe and the Pianist Who Never Played. Again, Chapter 1. The Client Who Wouldn't. Touch the keys. There are 3 things that will get Nero Wolfe out of his chair without the threat of imminent death. The smell of sautéed sweetbreads, a personal insult from Inspector Kramer, and, on rare occasions, the scent of a mystery wrapped tight enough to strangle a rhinoceros. Tuesday afternoon was cold, the kind of brittle cold that cracked the sidewalk seams and made the taxi horns sound like they were honking through frozen molasses. I had just returned from a jaunt to the corner deli with 2 pounds of pastrami, Fritz's instructions, when the doorbell buzzed with the urgency of a man who either needed help or had mistaken us for a firehouse. Fritz answered, and a moment later he peeked into the office with a look that suggested he'd just seen a ghost wearing Italian leather. "There is a lady to see Mr. Wolfe," he said, folding his hands like a man about to pray. "She says it is urgent," Wolfe grunted without looking up from his Pflaumenbaum quarterly. "Pfui! Send her away." I slid the pastrami onto Wolfe's desk, well out of reach, and stood. "If she comes in this weather, boss, she's either nuts or desperate. Might be worth 5 minutes." He didn't dignify that with a reply, but he did lift a hand, which for Wolfe was practically a standing ovation. Fritz nodded and disappeared, and a minute later ushered in a woman who could have stopped Fifth Avenue traffic, even if she had been dressed in a potato sack. She wasn't. She wore a bottle green coat trimmed with fur, and a scarf that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe. Her gloves were off, clutched in one hand, and the nails were manicured like a Steinway lid, black lacquer gleaming under the lamplight. She crossed the room with the grace of a woman who had been taught early that rooms would part for her. She didn't sit until Wolfe, after a theatrical sigh, waved a hand at the red leather chair opposite him. "My name is Sylvia Vance," she said, voice low like a pianist fingering the lower octaves before a concerto. "And I'm afraid I'm about to waste your time, Mr. Wolfe, but I didn't know where else to go." Wolfe lifted his eyes a fraction. "Miss Vance, wasting my time is a grievous offence. However, it is not yet criminal." He folded the quarter closed with a soft flap. "Proceed." She smiled faintly, but it was the kind of smile that suggested she'd forgotten how. "You may have heard of my brother Peter Vance?" Wolfe shut his eyes. "The pianist?" "Yes, or he was." I cleared my throat. "What happened? He broke his fingers or something?" That won me a look from Wolfe sharp enough to shave wood. I subsided. Sylvia Vance smoothed the fabric of her skirt, as if smoothing out a memory. "He was supposed to perform Friday night at Carnegie Hall, a new piece. It was going to be a career-defining night. He never showed." That got Wolfe's attention. He straightened a fraction in his chair, which, for him, was like a lesser man leaping onto a desk. Asked, "Stage fright? Nerves?" "No. Peter was meticulous, focused. This was his life." Her voice wavered just once. When the hall manager called to say he hadn't arrived, I knew something was wrong. "What do the police say?" Wolfe rumbled. "They think he ran off." She twisted her gloves. "They found his car at the East River. Keys inside. Nobody." Wolfe tapped a finger on the armrest, a soft tack-tack-tack. Suicide, presumed? She nodded stiffly. But Peter would never. And something else. She dug into her handbag, pulling out a small crumpled envelope. She held it out, like it might burn her fingers. I crossed the room to take it, unfolding the flap carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper, cheap stationery, no letterhead, typed in uneven letters, like an old manual typewriter, had coughed them out one by one. He played the wrong notes. He paid the price. No signature, no other marks. Just those 12 words. Even Wolfe's eyebrows rose 1/16 of an inch, which, in the Wolfe emotional Richter scale, was an earthquake. Sylvia Vance sat there, desperate, brittle and beautiful, as a broken music box. "I need to know, Mr. Wolfe. Did someone kill my brother, and why?" Wolfe closed his eyes again. I could practically see the wheels grinding behind that broad forehead. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the radiator and the ticking of the brass desk clock. Finally, he spoke. "Miss Vance, I charge high fees, inflexible terms, and brook no nonsense." He opened his eyes lazily. "But I am not immune to curiosity." He flicked his eyes at me. "Archie, get the details." Which meant, translated into English, "We're in." I pulled out my notebook, snapped my pen open, and settled in for what I could already tell was going to be a long, twisted, and thoroughly dangerous ride. Chapter 2. The Pianist's Last Day. By the time Sylvia Vance had finished recounting her brother's last known movements, I had 2 pages of notes and an itching sense that we weren't being told everything. Not because she was hiding it, but because she didn't know it herself. Wolfe, of course, had leaned back into his chair like a pasha, preparing for a long, leisurely afternoon of mental gymnastics. "Let us review," he said, his voice thick and precise. "Your brother, Peter Vance, left his residence last Friday afternoon with the intention of rehearsing privately at Carnegie Hall." "Yes," Sylvia said. "He preferred to rehearse late when no one was around. He hated distractions." I scribbled, "Late rehearsal hides no witnesses. Handy for someone with bad intentions." Wolfe's lips pressed into a line. "And after leaving home?" "That's just it. No one saw him after he left. The hall's night. Staff didn't even realize he hadn't arrived until almost 7 o'clock. Curious, Wolfe mused. No staff, no security. Minimal. It was supposed to be locked, but Peter had a master key from the director, Mr. Colton." She folded her hands tightly. They trusted him. I caught Wolfe's glance, the kind that meant tuck that name away for future discomfort. "What about his car?" I asked. "Was it parked at the hall or dumped first?" Sylvia shook her head. "That's unclear. The police said it was found the next morning near Pier 14. No signs of a struggle. Just abandoned, with the keys in the ignition and his sheet. Music on the front seat." "Sheet music?" Wolfe echoed, lacing his fingers together on his belly. "Yes. The composition he was supposed to debut." I frowned. "And you're sure it was his?" She gave a tight little smile. "I recognize his handwriting. He made notes all over it. Tiny annotations, phrasing marks." Wolfe opened his eyes a slit. "Did the police keep it?" I don't know. They might have, or they might have thought it was unimportant." Wolfe grunted. "Pfui, an artist's final markings are never unimportant." He let that hang in the air a moment before continuing. You have the original program listing for Friday's performance. Yes. She produced a slim folded pamphlet from her handbag, and I took it over to Wolfe. He opened it delicately with 2 fingers, as if it might carry contagion. The headline read, Carnegie Hall presents Peter Vance, an evening of new works, and classical favourites. Below that, the line-up was neatly printed. Chopin, Rachmaninoff. And at the end, in bold, world premiere, Nocturne for a City Dying, Peter Vance. I read the title twice. Either Peter Vance had a flair for the dramatic, or he knew something was coming. Wolfe tapped the pamphlet once with a thick forefinger. This composition, was it controversial? Sylvia hesitated. I leaned forward. Miss Vance? She pressed, her lips together, then exhaled. Peter wasn't political, not exactly, but his new piece, it was darker than anything he'd ever written. Angry. He said it was inspired by the corruption and decay he saw in the city. Wolfe's brows lifted infinitesimally. Specific corruption. He didn't say, only that people wouldn't like it. Well, I said lightly, people don't like sauerkraut either, but they don't usually toss you in the river for it. Wolfe's glance warned me of further humour. Miss Vance, he said, we require 2 things at once. A thorough search of your brother's apartment, and a comprehensive list of his acquaintances, enemies, and professional rivals. Her eyes widened. Enemies? Peter didn't have enemies. No man of substance lacks them, Wolfe said dryly, especially one preparing to air grievances to an audience of 3,000. Sylvia nodded, swallowing hard. I can get you the keys. Do so. She stood, smoothing her coat. Where should I leave them? I stood too. You can hand them to me. She hesitated a moment longer, as if stepping out of the brownstone would mean stepping into something she couldn't control, then dropped the ring of keys into my palm. They were cold, heavy, and uncomfortably final. After she was gone, Wolfe reached for the phone with a sigh that suggested lifting the receiver was equivalent to scaling Everest. He dialed a number from memory. When Inspector Kramer's gruff bark came on the line, Wolfe's lips twitched. Good afternoon, Inspector. I require information regarding Mr. Peter Vance. A pause. Then Kramer's voice, audible even across the room, barked something. I couldn't make out. No, I am not interfering, Wolfe said, voice oily with civility. I am, as always, pursuing a separate line of inquiry. More barking. Wolfe's eyebrows rose higher. I see, he said smoothly. So you are confident it was suicide, despite no note, no witnesses, and no body. The barking became sharper. Wolfe hung up with the calm satisfaction of a man dropping a hot potato onto someone else's plate. I waited. Wolfe didn't say anything. Well? I finally asked. Well, Archie? Wolfe lifted his glass of beer, his third of the afternoon, and drank deeply. Kramer, as expected, sees only what is convenient. You, however, must not. I tucked the keys into my coat pocket. You want me to go snoop through Peter Vance's apartment? Yes. Take care. Observe everything. Record details faithfully. And Archie? Yeah? Pay particular attention to the silences. That was Wolfe for you. Cryptic, infuriating, and damn it, usually right. I grabbed my hat and coat and headed out into the frozen jungle that was Manhattan in winter. The taste of mystery sharp in the air. Chapter 3. The apartment with no echo-peter. Vance's apartment was tucked into a neat little brick building on West 78th, a stone's throw from the park, and just far enough from Broadway to keep the tourists away. The street was quiet when I pulled up in a yellow cab that smelled like pickles and old cigars. I tipped the driver, tipped my hat to a passing poodle, and walked up the front steps with the kind of deliberate casualness that comes from years of knowing when not to look like a snoop. The building had that faded charm, brass fixtures dulled, by time ivy creeping up one side like it owned the place, and a doorman who watched me like I might be the second act of a crime play he'd seen before. "Mr. Vance isn't home," he said as I entered. I gave him my winningest smile. "No, I'm Archie Goodwin. I'm here with the family's permission." "Police? Private investigation? Licensed? Clean nails?" I flashed my credentials and the keys Sylvia had handed over. "His sister wants us to check the place before someone less polite decides, too." That did it. He nodded and hit the elevator button. The ride up was short and creaky. The apartment was on the 3rd floor, end of the hall, facing east. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and was immediately greeted by silence thick enough to chew. The kind of silence that doesn't just fill a space. It settles in and starts redecorating. I shut the door behind me and took a slow walk through Peter Vance's last known address. It was tidy, but not obsessively so. Bookshelves lined the far wall of the living room. Sheet music, classical theory, heavy German volumes with names I didn't pretend to pronounce. A sleek grand piano dominated the centre of the room, lid closed, the bench pulled out as if someone had risen and forgotten to return. On the top of the piano was a half-filled glass of water, dusty and untouched. I went to the kitchen first. Standard issue for the neighbourhood. Galley style, narrow, the smell of coffee lingering like a forgotten conversation. Dishes were in the drying rack. Refrigerator half-stocked. No signs of a hurried exit. No spilled wine or broken glass or smeared fingerprints. Just normal, which, considering the circumstances, was anything but. The bedroom was spare. A narrow bed, a tall armoire, and a writing desk with a neat stack of envelopes, all addressed, but not stamped. I noted them, 6 in total, addressed to various music institutions, agents, and one to someone named Arlo Temple. That one I pocketed for later inspection. Wolfe had taught me long ago, never ignore the lone outlier. I moved to the piano. The sheet music on the stand was not the infamous Nocturne for a City Dying, but a well-thumbed Chopin nocturne in C-sharp minor. The pages were marked in Chion's tight-scribbled pencil, arcs and arrows, notes on tempo, the usual, nothing sinister. But something about the room felt off. Not wrong, just unfinished. I crouched to check the foot pedals, and that's when I saw it, wedged just beneath the piano's left leg, barely visible unless you were at floor level. A torn piece of yellow sheet. I fished it out. It was a scrap of paper, jaggedly torn, with 5 handwritten words. "If he plays it, die." No signature, no punctuation. Just 5 words, linked in hasty black strokes, like someone had been in a hurry, or very, very angry. I stared at it a moment, then slid it carefully into my inner coat pocket. That was clue number 2. And unlike the typewritten note Sylvia had, shown us this one had been hidden, deliberately, maybe desperately, which meant someone close had left it. I swept the rest of the apartment. Nothing behind the curtains, no bloodstains, no hidden safes. The trash had been emptied, suspiciously so. In the bathroom, I found a damp towel that hadn't been folded, and in the closet, a jacket missing. Just one hanger slightly askew, the kind of detail most people miss, but Wolfe would have noticed before I blinked. Back in the living room, I let my eyes trace the walls, corners, surfaces, and then I saw it. Something that didn't match. On the piano's lid, where the dust had settled thick and lazy, there was a single clean circle, like a glass had once rested there and been removed. And next to it, barely noticeable, the faintest drag mark in the dust, like something had been pulled away. Another glass, or something else. I stood there a moment, watching the shadows stretch from the high windows as the city outside began to dim into late afternoon. It wasn't much, but it was something. One glass remained. The other was taken. 2 people. One warning note, and one pianist who had vanished without a trace. I made my exit just as the sun dipped below the rooftops, casting long blue slashes across the hallway carpet. I took the stairs down, slower than necessary, thinking it all through. Back at the street, I hailed a cab and pointed the driver south toward the brownstone. Wolfe was going to want the full report. Notes, impressions, and everything I hadn't said out loud. And if I knew Wolfe, he'd already be 5 steps ahead of me. Hell, maybe 6. Chapter 4. The Man Behind the Curtain. I got back to the brownstone around 6. The city already wrapped up in that cold twilight that made every street lamp look like a desperate candle against the dark. Fritz let me in with his usual polite nod, and I found Wolfe in the office, exactly where I'd left him, angled back in his chair, fingers steepled under his chin, a bottle of beer within easy reach. He opened one eye as I came in. Report. I peeled off my coat and tossed the scrap of ishtum yellow paper onto his desk. Found that under Vance's piano, along with a whole lot of nothing else. Wolfe picked up the scrap delicately, like it might sprout legs and bite him. He read it, grunted once, and set it down beside his beer. If he plays it, die. Voice was grim. A straightforward sentiment. Yeah, like a brick to the head. I dropped into my chair across from him and laid out the rest. The clean circle on the piano lid, the missing glass, the jacket that wasn't on its hanger, the 6 addressed but unstamped envelopes, the name Arlo Temple. At that last one, Wolfe's eyebrows did a little dance. Temple, he said. The impresario. Could be. Sylvia didn't mention him. Wolfe muttered something about amateurs and reached for the phone again. He dialed with the kind of languid precision that would have made a Swiss watch feel insecure. Operator, I require a number for Arlo Temple, Manhattan. While he waited, he glanced at me. The apartment was staged. Staged? He nodded once, not thoroughly, hastily, as if the culprit wished to simulate normalcy without understanding its finer textures. The operator came back. Wolfe jotted down a number with one of his custom Mont Blanc pens and punched the digits in with a pudgy finger. A brisk male voice answered after 2 rings. Temple, Wolfe said. This is Nero Wolfe. I require a few moments of your time regarding Peter Vance." There was a pause, long enough for me to hear the man on the other end take a breath, and then hold it. Finally, the voice came back, cautious. "I've already spoken to the police." "Indeed, I am not the police," Wolfe said, voice like velvet lined with barbed wire. "I am, however, retained by Mr. Vance's sister. Surely you wish to assist her." Another pause. Then, "All right, what do you want to know?" "First," Wolfe said, "your relationship with Peter Vance." "I booked him, handled some of his engagements, not exclusively, but he trusted me." "Did you know of his new composition, Nocturne, for a City Dying?" "Of course, he was obsessed with it, wouldn't shut up about it." "And your opinion?" Temple hesitated. "I thought it was dangerous." I sat up straighter. "In what sense?" Wolfe purred. "Peter said he was going to name names. Symbolically, sure, it's music, but still. People, institutions, corruption. He wanted it to be a wake-up call. I told him he was playing with fire." "And did he receive any threats?" There was a long, weighty silence. Then, "Yes, anonymous letters, ugly ones. He brushed them off." "Did you see them?" "No. He told me about them but didn't show me. I warned him to be careful, but Peter was stubborn." Wolfe allowed a pause to unspool between them, then said, "Did you attend Friday's concert?" "I was going to. I had a front-row seat reserved. When they announced he wasn't coming, I left. Figured he'd had a breakdown." "Pfui," Wolfe said, almost lazily. "Thank you, Mr. Temple. You have been most illuminating." He hung up without waiting for a farewell. I leaned forward. So he got threats, he ignored them, and now he's swimming with the fishes? "Presumably," Wolfe said, reaching for his beer. "But presumptions are the luxury of fools. We must deal in facts." He sipped, savouring it, then set the glass down. "Temple's admission aligns with our earlier deduction. The motive lies in Vance's composition. The question becomes, who among those feeling threatened acted to silence him?" I pointed at the stack of unstamped letters. "Maybe one of those 6 has an answer." "Possibly," Wolfe said, "but more pressing is the symbolism of the missing glass." I frowned. "Symbolism?" Wolfe's eyes gleamed. "2 glasses imply a meeting, an encounter, a visitor who did not intend to stay, or who wished their presence concealed." He shifted his bulk forward, a sign that the engines were revving. "We must determine," he said, "who shared a final drink with Peter Vance, and why that drink ended in silence." The doorbell rang then, sharp and urgent. Fritz's steps were swift and muted. A moment later, he entered the office with an arched eyebrow. "Mr. Colton," he said, "from Carnegie Hall." Wolfe smiled thinly. "Ah, the director. Admit him." I straightened my tie. Wolfe settled deeper into his chair. Another piece of the puzzle was about to walk through our door, and if Wolfe was right, it might be a piece someone would soon regret ever moving into play. Chapter 5. The Man from Carnegie Hall. Mr. Colton entered the office with the kind of brisk energy that suggested he thought time was money, and both were in short supply. Mid-50s, sharp grey suit, balding on top, but not apologizing for it, and a face that looked like it had spent too many years negotiating backstage dramas and egos bigger than concert grand pianos. He clutched his hat in one hand, a sleek fedora that didn't quite match the sweat beading at his temples. Fritz showed him to the red leather chair, and he sat, perching like a man ready to spring up again at the slightest excuse. "Nero Wolfe?" he asked, eyes darting between Wolfe and me. Wolfe inclined his head a bare fraction. "I am he, and this is Mr. Goodwin, my assistant." I gave him a nod, which he returned distractedly. "I'm sorry to intrude," Colton said, smoothing his hat unnecessarily, "but Miss Vance mentioned she was engaging you. I thought it prudent to offer any assistance I can. Peter's disappearance has been—" He hesitated, choosing his words like a man crossing a minefield. "A tragedy for all of us." Wolfe, who didn't believe in niceties unless they came, with butter sauce, cut straight in. "You were Peter Vance's professional superior." "I'm the director of programming at Carnegie Hall. I oversee performances, scheduling, bookings." Colton's voice was crisp, cultivated, but his hands kept worrying at his hat. "Peter was one of our most promising artists. His Friday debut was highly anticipated." "You provided him a key to the hall," Wolfe said. Colton nodded. "Standard procedure for soloists who rehearse after hours. We trust our artists." Trust. Wolfe let the word hang in the air like a wasp. Was there any concern about Peter's latest composition? Colton shifted in his seat. There was discussion. His Nocturne for a City Dying had a reputation before a single note was performed. Whispers, you understand, that it was provocative. "In what way?" I asked. He exhaled sharply through his nose. Peter claimed it was a musical portrait of moral decay in New York. He refused to clarify whether specific people were being depicted, but the implication was there. And some of our patrons, influential patrons, were uneasy. "Names," Wolfe said bluntly. Colton hesitated, glancing at the door like he expected a subpoena to burst through it. Certain board members, sponsors, donors, people who don't enjoy being associated with scandal. "And did any of these worried patrons contact you directly?" Wolfe pressed. "Yes." Colton's mouth tightened. "1 or 2 calls, urging us to reconsider the performance, to perhaps encourage Peter to select a different piece." "And did you?" "No." He shook his head firmly. "I told them Peter was an artist, and we didn't censor our performers." Wolfe snorted quietly, his version of a round of applause. Did Peter know about these objections?" I asked. "I told him," Colton said, grimacing. "He laughed, said if they were nervous, it only proved his point." Wolfe shifted slightly, fingers drumming against the arm of his chair. "On the night in question, were you at the hall?" "Yes." "I arrived an hour before curtain. I assumed Peter was in a practice room, preparing. It wasn't until 20 minutes before showtime that we realized he hadn't signed in." "And after that?" I asked. Colton's hands twisted his hat tighter. "I made a few discreet inquiries, checked the green rooms, sent someone to call his apartment. When we couldn't find him, we delayed the performance, then ultimately cancelled it. No visitors backstage, no strangers lingering about?" Wolfe asked. "None that I recognized. But the hall is busy. It's impossible to monitor every door, every corridor." Wolfe let that sit for a beat. "Mr. Colton," he said finally, voice a shade softer, "one last question. In your opinion, was Peter Vance the kind of man to vanish voluntarily?" Colton shook his head with a certainty that didn't need further explanation. No, Peter loved the spotlight. He lived for the stage. To think he'd throw it away on a whim. His voice cracked slightly. It's inconceivable, Wolfe nodded once, a regal dismissal. Thank you, Mr. Colton. That will suffice for now. Colton stood smoothing his jacket with trembling hands. If I can be of any further assistance, you shall hear from us, Wolfe said. He waited until the door had closed behind Colton before reaching for his beer. I stood, pacing to the window and back. Well, another concerned citizen who says everything but what we need. Wolfe sipped, set the glass down, and closed his eyes. On the contrary, Archie, Mr. Colton said quite enough. Such as the fact that Peter's composition made powerful men nervous enough to intervene, yet none took direct action publicly. Fear of scandal, preservation of reputation, a fertile ground for secret measures. He opened his eyes and fixed me with a look as sharp as a paring knife. And Archie, I am increasingly certain Peter Vance did not vanish because he chose to. There was a moment of stillness. The radiator hissed. The clock ticked. Then Wolfe spoke again. Voice, low and deliberate. We must identify the one man whose reputation could not survive the music Peter intended to play, and who was willing to silence him before a single note sounded. And if that didn't sound like an invitation to dive headfirst into a nest of snakes, I didn't know what did. Chapter 6. A Visit to the Invisible Enemy. The next morning, Wolfe called me into the office before I could even finish my second cup of coffee. That was unusual. Wolfe considered mornings sacred and communication before noon a personal affront, so when Fritz summoned me with a pointed look, I knew the gears were grinding faster than usual. Wolfe was already in his chair, looking fresh and foul-tempered, a dangerous combination. He gestured towards the chair across from him. Archie, we must proceed delicately. The logical structure of the case demands it. Meaning? I asked, settling in. Meaning, Wolfe said. We must prod certain individuals into revealing themselves, without alerting them that they are under suspicion. I grinned. Ah, the subtle touch. Just my specialty. He ignored that. Today you will visit Arlo Temple. Raised an eyebrow. The impresario. Indeed. Under the pretense of clarifying Peter Vance's final business dealings. Ask impertinent questions. Watch his reactions. Above all, observe his silences. I pulled my notebook from my pocket. Anything in particular you want me to poke at? His knowledge of Peter's enemies. His financial interest in Peter's career. Whether he benefited or suffered from Peter's disappearance. And if he stonewalls? Wolfe permitted himself a thin smile. Apply pressure as you see fit, which coming from Wolfe was like being handed a license to practice psychological dentistry. I finished my coffee, grabbed my coat, and headed for Temple's office, which turned out to be a sleek, second-story suite off Madison Avenue. Plush carpet, polished brass fixtures, the whole 9 yards. The receptionist, a redhead with a voice like velvet and an attitude to match, informed me that Mr. Temple was in, but unscheduled visits were discouraged. I showed her my license and smiled in a way that suggested discouragement was a two-way street. 2 minutes later, I was ushered into a spacious office where Arlo Temple sat behind a walnut desk, fingers steepled, eyes cool. He was tall, lean, and wore a suit that probably cost more than my monthly salary. He looked like he could play both sides of a deal without mussing his hair. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, voiced smooth as a radio announcer's. "To what do I owe the honour?" "I'm following up on Peter Vance," I said, taking the chair he didn't offer. "You spoke with my employer yesterday." So I gathered. His smile didn't reach his eyes. I trust I was helpful. I shrugged. "You were conversational. Now I'm hoping you'll be illuminating." His fingers tapped lightly on the desk. "Ask. Did Peter owe anyone money?" "No." "Immediate. Peter was careful with finances. His sister handled most of his accounts. He focused on music. Any enemies?" Temple hesitated just long enough for me to notice. "Not enemies," he said carefully. "Jealous colleagues, perhaps. Rival pianists. But Peter wasn't one for petty feuds." "What about powerful enemies?" I pressed. He was planning to make some noise with that composition of his. Temple's mouth tightened. "You must understand, Mr. Goodwin, art is interpretation. Peter claimed to be making a statement, but it was allegorical." "That's not how some people saw it." A flash of irritation crossed his face. "If someone took offense at a piece of music, that's their weakness, not Peter's. Unless," I said lightly, "they decided to make it Peter's problem." Silence. Just a beat too long. I decided to stir the pot a little. "I've heard rumours," I said, flipping open my notebook, "that some very large donors were unhappy, threatening to pull funding, cause trouble for the hall." Temple's gaze sharpened. "Who told you that?" I smiled. "I'm the one asking questions. Today." He leaned back, arms folding. "Donors are sensitive. They don't like being mocked, even musically. But to suggest anyone would harm Peter..." He shook his head. "That's absurd." "Is it?" I asked. "You said to yourself he was warned." "I said he received letters. Anonymous ones. Idle threats. Maybe not so idle." Another silence. Temple drummed his fingers again. Faster now. "If you're implying that one of our benefactors harmed Peter Vance," he said tightly, "you're reaching." "Maybe," I said, standing. "Or maybe I'm just tuning the piano before the real music starts." I left him with that, walking out past the frosty receptionist without a backward glance. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was in the plant rooms, so I dumped my notes on his desk and went to the kitchen for something edible. When he finally returned an hour later, he read the notes with a grunt of approval. "Temple knows more than he dares admit," Wolfe said, "but he is cautious. He will not act unless provoked." "Provoked how?" Wolfe's eyes gleamed. "By fear, Archie. By the threat of exposure. By the suggestion that the trail we follow leads directly to his patrons." "And how do we suggest that?" I asked. Wolfe allowed himself a rare, predatory smile. "We bait the trap." I had the distinct feeling that before long, the real players in this little drama would start showing their hands, and that, when they did, the cost would be measured not in dollars, but in blood. Chapter 7. The Music That Made Enemies. Wolfe's idea of baiting the trap didn't involve anything as crude as an announcement or a flyer nailed to a lamppost. Instead, he dictated a polite, razor-sharp letter to Sylvia Vance, which I typed up and delivered by hand. In it, Wolfe requested a copy of any surviving notes, drafts, or annotated sheets Peter had composed for Nocturne for a City Dying. Sylvia's eyes widened when she read it, but she nodded and promised to look. She didn't ask why, which showed either admirable restraint or a growing understanding that Wolfe didn't waste movements or words. By the next afternoon, a brown paper envelope arrived at the brownstone, hand-delivered by a courier. Inside, wrapped carefully in tissue, were 6 sheets of music, each scrawled with Peter's precise, intense handwriting. The title was inked at the top in block letters. Nocturne for a City Dying. I watched as Wolfe handled the pages delicately, examining the margins, frowning occasionally, sniffing once, as if the ink itself might offer a clue. "You recognize it?" I asked. "I recognize the pattern," Wolfe murmured. "Listen, Archie." He pointed at the notes scribbled in the margins. Names, not musical notations, but actual names. Langford, Hessel, D'Amico, Willoughby, each associated with a section of the music. I whistled low. He wasn't being allegorical. He was writing a soundtrack for real people. "Precisely," Wolfe said. "Each segment, each movement, corresponds to a figure of public standing. Likely individuals Peter considered emblematic of the city's decay." Flipped my notebook open. Langford, head of the Transit Authority. Hessel, big real estate tycoon. D'Amico owns half the East Side construction business. And Willoughby, Wolfe said, a patron of the arts, one of Carnegie Hall's largest donors. I sat back. If Peter made all that public, it wouldn't just be a scandal. It'd be a career execution for them, not him. Or so he believed, Wolfe said. But the exposure of rot, Archie, does not occur without odour. And those invested in silence often pay dearly to maintain it. I tapped my pen against the notebook. "So, which one did it?" "That," Wolfe said, "we must determine." He leaned back, tenting his fingers. "You will visit Mr. Willoughby, not formally, casually, as a reporter perhaps." I grinned. "You want me to play newspaperman?" "Indeed, dangle the prospect of an upcoming exposé on Peter Vance. Watch how he reacts. And the others? In time. One thread at a time, Archie. Lest the garment tear before we see the seam." By late afternoon, and I was walking up the marble steps of Willoughby's townhouse, one of those grand limestone affairs that looked like it hadn't changed since Roosevelt was president, and not the one with the cigar. The butler took one look at my borrowed press badge, courtesy of Saul Panzer's less-than-legal connections, and frowned like I'd tracked mud on the carpet. Still, he let me in and showed me to a library that could have housed half the city's population, and still had room for a string quartet. Willoughby entered a moment later. He was shorter than I expected, heavy-set, dressed like he was about to pose for a statue. His handshake was limp, his smile thinner than a cheap violin string. "Mr. Goodwin, is it?" he said. "Yes, sir. Doing a piece on Peter Vance, his upcoming works, the controversy, the excitement." He froze just for a fraction of a second. Enough to tell me the name still had weight. Tragic, his disappearance, Willoughby said smoothly. "A loss to the city's culture," I nodded, letting the silence stretch. Most men can't resist filling a silence. Willoughby was no exception. "I sponsored several of Peter's early performances," he added. "He was promising." "But," I prompted. He hesitated, then sighed. A young man of talent but little discretion. His latest ambitions were concerning. Because of the content? I asked, feigning innocence. Because of the recklessness, he snapped before catching himself. Artists must be careful with how they wield influence. They must consider the implications. Implications like calling out corruption? His smile slipped again. I believe in free expression, but there are lines. Civilization depends on them. And Peter crossed one. He looked at me hard. He would have. I let that sit. Then I thanked him for his time, offered the appropriate murmurs about deadlines and printing schedules, and let myself out. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe listened to my account without interruption, eyes half closed. When I finished, he opened them and said, Willoughby's fear is genuine, but it is not the fear of a guilty man. I blinked. Then, he fears exposure, Wolfe said calmly. But he fears public shame, not personal implication. No, Archie, our culprit is closer, more desperate, less practiced at hiding their terror. Closed his eyes again, steepling his fingers. The enemy we seek, he said, is not seated in the halls of power. He is seated behind the curtains, pulling strings in the dark, and growing increasingly aware that we are approaching the stage. The real show, it seemed, was only just beginning. Chapter 8. Shadows in the green room. Wolfe spent most of the next morning in his chair, unmoving, eyes shut in that theatrical trance he called thinking. He didn't eat until noon. He didn't speak until nearly 1. And when he finally did, it was only to demand that I get Saul Panzer on the phone. Saul, of course, answered on the second ring. If you're unfamiliar with Saul, imagine a man with the stealth of a pickpocket and the attention to detail of a librarian during tax season. Wolfe gave him his marching orders in 3 clipped sentences. Peter Vance. Background on every name in his sheet music margins, particularly Langford and Hessel. Focus on conflicts, financial, political, or personal. He hung up without a goodbye. Give Saul 4 hours, Wolfe said. In the meantime, you will go back to Carnegie Hall. What for? You will speak to the stage manager. Quietly. Avoid Mr. Colton if possible. Focus on the green room. See if anyone recalls. Visitors the night Peter disappeared. Backstage gossip, I said, grabbing my coat. Now we're getting somewhere. Carnegie Hall was its usual mix of old grandeur and stressed-out staffers trying to act like they weren't managing a symphony, and 3 divorces simultaneously. I showed my license to a pimple-faced assistant who looked like he'd rather be practicing the cello, and got directed to a stocky man in a black windbreaker labelled Event Crew. Name's Mendez, he said after I introduced myself. Stage, manager, 13 years. You're with the sister. Sort of. We're investigating Peter Vance's disappearance. Mendez scratched his chin. Yeah, that was weird. Kid was intense, but polite. Always on time. Always showed up for rehearsal. Not last Friday, I said. Nope, he said. I was here. I unlocked the janitor around 5. Peter was supposed to arrive by 6. Never did. Anyone else come in asking for him? He frowned, thinking. Couple folks. The director, Colton, the sound tech, some piano tuner who bailed when he heard Peter hadn't arrived. No friends, no strangers. He hesitated. There was one guy. Bingo. I leaned in. Describe him. Tall, maybe 6'3", trench coat, Knew his way around. Didn't ask for directions. Looked like he'd been backstage before. Said he had sheet music for Peter. Wouldn't leave a name. What time? Maybe 6:15. I was dealing with a broken monitor in the tech booth. Caught a glimpse of the guy heading towards the practice rooms. Figured he was on Peter's team. Did he leave? Mendez nodded. 20 minutes later, alone. Seemed in a hurry. Didn't say a word on his way out. That fit the timeline. If Peter arrived early to rehearse, and this visitor met him privately, it could have been the last time anyone saw him alive. Security cameras? I asked. Mendez snorted. You're lucky the plumbing works. No budget for cameras backstage. Of course. I left my card with Mendez, along with a modest $20 bill, to jog his memory in case he remembered anything else. Then I headed back to the brownstone, brain churning. Wolfe was finishing a plate of braised duck when I returned. I waited until Fritz cleared the tray before laying it all out. The green room mystery guest, I said. Tall guy, trench coat, had music, left fast. Wolfe's face darkened. That confirms it, he murmured. Vance met someone he trusted, someone who brought something, either forged, threatening, or both. Could be the one who wrote the typed note, I offered. Wolfe nodded. Or the one who tried to prevent him from playing. I handed him a second envelope Sylvia had forwarded. Peter's personal calendar. In it were practice times, appointment notes, and scrawled symbols only Peter could decode. But one entry stood out. Friday, 5:15 p.m. To deliver a draft. I said. Initials. Wolfe tapped his temple. Possibly, possibly not. The only other R in his calendar is 2 weeks prior. Same phrasing, same vagueness. Could be the same person who visited Carnegie, I said. Tall guy, trench coat. Wolfe picked up the calendar and leafed through it again. We need a list of everyone associated with Vance who matches that initial. Professional, personal, peripheral. The phone rang then. I answered. Saul's voice came through crisp and precise. Langford's in deep with the transit union. Hessel's been buying up foreclosed properties through shell companies. D'Amico's construction firm is under quiet investigation for kickbacks. And Willoughby? I asked. Clean as a whistle. But his name's been linked to a private foundation, the same one that funds Temple's artist grants. I blinked. Are Temple's involved? More than involved, Saul said. He's a board member, one of 3. The other 2, I braced myself. Langford and Hessel. I hung up and turned to Wolfe, who had already started smiling. Not a friendly smile, but the kind of smile that meant he'd just seen the last 2 puzzle pieces fall into place. Archie, he said, fetch Miss Vance and tell Mr. Kramer we may soon be obliging him. What should I tell them? Tell them, Wolfe said, voice like thunder through velvet, that the pianist didn't die for the music. He died in silence. And for the first time since the case began, I believed we were close, not just to the motive or the method, but to the man who had written the final note. Chapter 9. A Trap in G. Majoret was close to 6 when Sylvia Vance arrived at the brownstone, bundled in a dark wool coat and clutching a small black handbag like it held her last ounce of control. Fritz showed her into the office without fuss. Wolfe greeted her with his usual lack of ceremony, which in this case meant he didn't growl or glance at the clock. She sat stiffly in the red chair, her eyes scanning both of us. "Have you found something?" "Yes," Wolfe said. "But first I must ask you to listen carefully and speak with precision. You are about to be included in a delicate maneuver, and I cannot afford missteps." She nodded once. "Anything?" Wolfe glanced at me. I gave her the short version. The private foundation, the shared connection between Temple, Langford, and Hessel, the green room visitor with no name but a shadow in Vance's calendar. When I mentioned the 5:15 appointment labelled R to deliver draft, her brow furrowed. "Could that be a Temple?" I asked. "No. Peter never referred to him with initials. If anything, he would have written A.T. or just Temple." "Someone closer then," I said. "A friend? Colleague?" She hesitated. There was one man Peter mentioned sometimes, Roland Kerr, a composer. They had collaborated on a few ideas. Roland was volatile. "Volatile how?" Wolfe asked. "Ambitious, bitter." He felt overlooked. Peter said Roland envied him. "Where is Mr. Kerr now?" Wolfe asked. She frowned. "I don't know. I haven't seen him in months." Wolfe leaned forward slightly. "You must reach him. Call him. Tell him you've found something. Peter's final notes, or a tape, or a journal. Something he would want to see. You want to lure him. Here." "I want to observe him," Wolfe said. "How a man reacts when faced with a truth he believes buried is often more revealing than anything he says." She exhaled slowly. "All right, I'll try." We gave her privacy to make the call. From the hallway, I caught snippets. Sylvia keeping her voice light, offering a vague but urgent reason to meet, saying she was at our office, and could he come by soon. She came back in 5 minutes, pale but composed. "He'll be here within the hour." Wolfe nodded and instructed Fritz to have the drawing room prepared. "Not the office. I do not wish to startle him." The wait was quiet. Wolfe sat unmoving. I stood near the front window, watching the street. Sylvia stared at the darkening skyline beyond the glass. At 7:03 p.m., a cab pulled up. A man got out, tall, thin, in a wrinkled brown coat and a scarf that didn't match. He moved with a kind of hesitant energy, like he wasn't sure he wanted to be where he was. Roland Kerr. I opened the door before he rang. "Miss Vance is inside," I said. "Come in." He blinked at me, wary. "Who are you?" "Archie Goodwin. I work with Mr. Wolfe." "Don't worry, you're in good hands." He followed me in, scanning the hallway like it might bite him. Wolfe was waiting in the drawing room, surrounded by the scent of orchids. Sylvia stood, hands clasped. "Kerr," Wolfe said without rising. "Sit." He did, glancing from face to face. "I didn't realize this was formal." "It is not," Wolfe said. "It is, however, necessary." Kerr leaned forward. "Where is it?" Wolfe steepled his fingers. "Where is what?" "The dirty manuscript," Sylvia said. "I know what she said," Wolfe interrupted, "but there is no manuscript, not here, not intact." Kerr froze. "Then why—" "To observe," Wolfe said smoothly, "to see how you respond when confronted with something you hoped would remain hidden." Kerr's face changed. Slowly. A tremor at the jaw. A twitch at the corner of the eye. "You think I did something to Peter?" he said, trying to laugh. "That's absurd." "No," Wolfe said calmly. "I think you were used to it. Manipulated. perhaps even bribed. I what? Wolfe's eyes glinted. You delivered something to Peter last Friday. Sheet music, perhaps. But it was not what he expected. Or perhaps it was exactly what he feared. A threat. A forgery. You were the messenger, not the architect. You stood abruptly. This is ridiculous. You visited the hall. You went backstage. Mendez saw you. Kerr's breath caught. You claimed to be delivering music. Wolfe continued. Peter was expecting someone. You filled the role, but the message wasn't yours. Kerr sat back down slowly, as if gravity had increased. I didn't. He started, then stopped. Wolfe's voice was soft now. Who gave you the papers, Mr. Kerr? For a moment, silence, then Temple. The name fell like a stone in a still pond. He called me the day before, Kerr said, voice flat. Said Peter needed something hand-delivered, something sensitive. Asked me to go in quietly. Said Peter was expecting it, that it would smooth things over. Did you read it? Wolfe asked. I glanced at it, Kerr admitted. I didn't understand most of it. Just a few sentences. If you perform the piece, we release everything. Something about compromising material. It looked official. Blackmail, I said. Kerr nodded slowly. When Peter saw it, he got pale, said it was a setup, told me to leave. And you did. I didn't think... He looked up, horror starting to settle behind his eyes. I didn't know what would happen. You were the unwitting bridge, Wolfe said. Temple couldn't risk being seen. He needed a proxy. Kerr's face sagged. I swear I didn't know. Wolfe closed his eyes. Mr. Goodwin, he said, call Inspector Kramer. I nodded. And Mr. Kerr, do not attempt to leave. The pianist had vanished. The music had been silenced. But now, at last, the curtain was rising on the truth. Chapter 10. Curtain call for the guilty. Kramer showed up fast, which meant he'd already had his suspicions boiling, and didn't like the idea of Wolfe handing him the case with a neat little ribbon tied around it. He arrived with Pearlie Stebbins, in tow, the latter looking sour enough to curdle milk, and stomped into the brownstone like he owned it. He didn't bother with greetings. All right, Wolfe, what circus act have you cooked up this time? Wolfe, who'd risen exactly half an inch from his chair as a gesture of hospitality, gestured broadly. Sit, Inspector. I have no wish to shout. Kramer sat, hard, and yanked out a battered notepad. Start talking, he growled. Wolfe steepled his fingers, his voice smooth. The disappearance of Peter Vance was not an accident, nor an act of self-destruction. It was a calculated silencing. He glanced at Kerr, who sat wringing his hands, like a man waiting for a verdict. Mr. Kerr, under pressure but without malicious intent, delivered to Mr. Vance a document forged by Arlo Temple, a blackmail note, falsely suggesting that if Vance performed his composition, evidence of alleged scandals, real or fabricated, would be released. Kramer frowned. Blackmail? Over a piece of music? Over the implications of that music, Wolfe said. Vance's new composition is named, symbolically but recognizably, Powerful Men. Men who feared exposure. Temple, whose fortunes were intertwined with theirs, acted to preserve his own interests and theirs. Preserve them how? Kramer asked. I can see a threat. But murder? Wolfe's voice dropped a notch. Peter Vance refused to be intimidated. After receiving the note, he informed Temple, directly or through inference, that he would still perform. "And Temple panicked," I put in. Wolfe nodded. He could not allow the performance to proceed. He lured Vance, possibly through a second meeting that evening, offering further negotiations or apologies. Instead, he murdered him, or arranged for it, and disposed of the body to simulate a suicide. Kramer leaned back, scowling fiercely. "That's a hell of a leap, Wolfe. You got proof?" "Proof is a matter of evidence," Wolfe said calmly. "You will find traces in Temple's office. Copies of the forged notes, drafts, perhaps communications, with Langford and Hessel regarding the Foundation's funding risks. More damning still," he pointed at Kerr. "Mr. Kerr's testimony places Temple at the center of the plan. Motive, opportunity, and deception." Kramer looked at Kerr, who swallowed hard and nodded miserably. "I didn't know what it was," Kerr said, hoarsely. "I didn't know they'd kill him." Pearlie shifted his bulk, already itching to move. "Where's Temple now?" Kramer barked. "At his office," Wolfe said, "unless he has been tipped off and decided to abscond." Kramer snapped his fingers at Stebbins. "Get a team down there, now!" Stebbins hustled out, and Kramer rose, looming over Wolfe's desk. "You better be right, Wolfe. You better be very damn right." Wolfe merely closed his eyes, signalling that the matter, to his mind, was already settled. Within the hour, Pearlie called, back to report they'd found Temple still in his office, trying to burn papers in a steel wastebasket when they arrived. It took 3 men to drag him out, while he screamed about misunderstandings and conspiracies. Proof enough for Kramer, who returned to the brownstone in a considerably better mood. "You got lucky," he muttered, tapping his hat against his knee. "Again." "It was not luck," Wolfe said dryly. "It was a deduction." Kramer grunted, his version of thanks, and left without shaking anyone's hand. Sylvia sat in the corner, silent through the entire revelation. Now, as the room emptied of police and tension, she stood, smoothing her gloves. "Thank you," she said simply. Wolfe inclined his head, more acknowledgement than he gave most clients. "Your brother was a man of integrity. It cost him his life, but it will not cost him his name." She nodded once, turned, and left the brownstone with her head high. I poured myself a stiff drink from the decanter Fritz kept tucked behind the globe. Wolfe, of course, settled back into his chair, eyes closed, fingers laced across his stomach. "Another masterpiece, boss," I said. "You realize you untangled this whole thing without leaving your chair." "Pfui," Wolfe said without opening his eyes. "I left the chair, briefly." I grinned into my glass. "So what now?" "Now," Wolfe murmured, "we resume the only civilized pursuits left to man, the tending of orchids and the consumption of beer." With that, the great Nero Wolfe drifted into the kind of peace only a completed puzzle could provide, while the city outside, unrepentant and oblivious, roared on. Chapter 11. Echoes of the Final Note. The next day came with the kind of sunlight that tries to fool you into believing the city's clean again. Streets sparkled like they'd been hosed down in the night. The newsboys shouted headlines about Temple's arrest, calling him a cultural mogul in corruption scandal. I bought a copy, mostly out of habit, and brought it back with the morning bagels. Wolfe didn't comment when I laid the paper on his desk. He didn't need to. He'd already read it, probably twice, and noted every factual omission with contempt. The Times in Wolfe's eyes had the memory of a goldfish and the depth of a puddle. "Predictable," he murmured without looking up. "They downplay the foundation. They emphasize Temple's eccentricities. No mention of Peter's composition or what it revealed." "They're keeping the rot under wraps," I said. "No surprise. Langford and Hessel have lawyers and influence." Wolfe grunted, "which they will use to insulate themselves. Temple will absorb the scandal. The others will retreat into the shadows. It is the way of things." "But not justice," I said. "No," Wolfe admitted, "but in this instance, exposure was enough. Let the city pretend its institutions remain unsullied. Let it sleep." He reached for his beer with the air of a man finished with humanity until lunch. It might have ended there, with a sour taste and a few more headlines. But fate, being the petulant playwright it is, had one more scene to stage. That afternoon, a thin, wiry man showed up at the brownstone. Late 50s, rumpled trenchcoat, nicotine-stained fingers. Said his name was Jacob Dunn. Claimed to be Peter Vance's former teacher. "I tried to reach Peter after I heard the news," he said as we sat him in the office. "Then I read about the Temple. Figured you'd want this." He pulled out a small cloth-bound notebook, old, battered, and frayed at the corners. "I gave this to Peter years ago," Dunn said. "Told him to use it whenever he heard something worth remembering. He called it his silent journal, said it helped him think without talking." Wolfe opened the notebook. Inside were pages of cramped, dense handwriting. Ideas, fragments of melody. And then, near the back, dated 3 days before his disappearance. "He warned me again today. Said the piece was suicide. I asked if he meant career suicide. He said, 'No, Peter, the kind where you don't wake up.'" Wolfe read the line 3 times, slowly. He handed the book to me and leaned back, his eyes shuttered. Dunn watched us both. He was scared. That much I know. But he wouldn't stop. He thought the music mattered more. "He was right," Wolfe said softly. That night, Sylvia returned, one last time. We gave her the journal. She took it with both hands, reverently, then surprised us by sitting down in the red chair and staying quiet for a long minute. "He wanted people to hear it," she said finally, "to know, even if it cost him everything." "You can still honor that," Wolfe said. "Let the music be played." She looked up. "Even now?" Especially now. She didn't speak again, but she nodded, and in that nod was a steel stronger than most speeches. A week later, Carnegie Hall was packed. No glitz, no champagne, no program with donor names. Just a black stage, a single grand piano, and the sheet music Peter Vance had died for. They called it a memorial. But it wasn't quiet. It was furious, beautiful, and raw, each note hammered at the city's conscience. Every crescendo cut through marble and pretense. When the final chord rang out, no one clapped for a full 10 seconds. And then the applause came. Not polite, not restrained, like thunder, like justice that had finally found its voice. Wolfe didn't attend, of course, but he sat by the radio, eyes closed, head tilted slightly, listening to the live broadcast from the study. I sat across the room, watching him as the final echoes faded into silence. He didn't speak for a long time. Then, finally, he was not wrong. The city is dying, but perhaps not without leaving a trace of grace. And with that, he poured himself a beer, opened his book of orchids and resumed living, exactly as he always had, beneath a world still struggling to hear its own music. Chapter 12. The Silence That Played On. It was 2 weeks after the concert when the final piece slid quietly into place, almost as an afterthought. Wolfe and I were both in the office, the windows cracked to let in what passed for spring air in Manhattan's damp with car exhaust and the faint perfume of melting snow. Mail was piled on Wolfe's desk, mostly invitations to fundraisers he'd never attend and catalogues he'd pretend not to read. One manila envelope, thin and unmarked, had no return address. I slit it open and pulled out a single sheet of paper, typed, uneven, familiar. It was always going to be you, Peter, but you wouldn't bend. You thought the city would choose the truth. It won't. It never has. You wrote the score. I just turned the page. No signature, no clue where it had been sent from, but we didn't need one. I handed it to Wolfe, who read it without comment. He set it on the blotter beside the others, the first typewritten threat Sylvia had brought, and the forged blackmail note delivered by Roland Kerr. "It's Temple," I said. "One last confession." "No," Wolfe said, his voice low. "It's not." I blinked. "Not?" He turned to me, eyes sharp. Temple was the instrument, not the composer. He tapped the letter once. "This is the work of Langford." "But—" Temple wrote the forged note. Kerr delivered it. But Langford arranged the terms. He crafted the blackmail, pressured Temple to act, threatened funding, set the framework in motion. When Peter didn't flinch, Temple panicked and carried out the deed. He leaned back, eyes narrowed. But Langford wrote the melody. It's his signature here, poetic, cruel, arrogant. He believes the matter is closed. I whistled low. "So why send this now?" "Because the concert happened," Wolfe said. "Because the truth Peter tried to preserve wasn't buried. And that terrifies men like Langford." He wanted to hear silence. Instead, he heard himself in the music. We sat in that silence for a while, a quieter one, the kind Wolfe liked, thoughtful, complete. Eventually he spoke again. "Justice is not always delivered through courts or police, Archie. Sometimes it's delivered through memory, through what people refuse to forget." I nodded. Peter Vance played his piece, even if it killed him. Especially because it killed him. I stood and walked to the window. Outside, New York was doing what it always did, forgetting, honking, hustling, lying to itself about what mattered. But somewhere out there, someone had heard that final note. Someone remembered. And inside that brownstone on West 35th, a man who never left his house had made sure of it. "Beer?" I asked. Wolfe raised an eyebrow. "Naturally." I fetched 2 bottles. We clinked them together in a toast. Not to the city, and certainly not to justice, but to music, to memory, and to the silence that finally spoke. The end.